capturing final performances. And that's a little bit scary to me because I need to digest something before I kind of flip it on its head. So yeah, as much as I can get a lay of the land and not go in blind, and still maintain some of the perspective, as to not kind of burn out on the song. But yeah, as long as I know where we're going and I know everything is okay, that's the bare minimum of pre-production I'm happy with.
Awesome. Yeah, so why don't you, I guess, walk us through your approach to producing a metal record or a heavy record? What usually happens after that?
Well, yeah. So, assuming we've kind of ironed out any kinks in the arrangements and what's already been written, generally we'll move on to drums first. Not always. It heavily depends on the genre. I'm not going to approach a metalcore or gent or death metal record the same way as I might approach, say, like a stoner or a doom, more sludge kind of influenced record, because they're going to require different approaches to get to different end goals. They're all under the umbrella of heavy music, but the doom and sludge and stoner and stuff like that tends to be more organic and a little bit looser and a little bit more in the traditional kind of band format than some of the more modern subgenres like metalcore or deathcore or what have you. If we're doing something a bit more modern, I guess there's room to do the drums last. But generally, it'll start off with the drums. I might spend a day to a half a day, depending on the budget, getting a drum sound, tuning drums, changing heads.
Wow.
Deciding on, something I do pretty often is overdub drums. So, like we might use a kick drum like with a mesh head, or we might use an e-kick pad. We might overdub tom parts so there's no cymbals leaking in. So I'll kind of like during pre-production, I've usually decided whether that's the path we're going to take or not, and I'll set up the drums and pull a tone accordingly. And then from there, it's really about getting performances. Obviously, I'm pretty obsessive with the technical side of things, like tuning, phase, and all of the kind of engineering things you have to account for. But once that is good to go, it's really all about the performance. So I guess if there's a hierarchy of needs that go into a good recording or a good production, then a great performance is paramount. It's really important for me. So we'll spend a majority of the time just pushing through and getting take after take and comping generally. And once the drums are done, I'll move on to editing, depending on the schedule. I mean, as we were talking about before, doing things in smaller sessions, that affords me a bit of an opportunity to edit the drums. So, and that's that. Of course, it comes back to the genre, but in most heavy music, having everything insanely precise and on the borderline of robotically tight is part of the overall aesthetic and the overall
it's part of the gig.
It's part of the gig. So and I mean, I'm lucky in that I've been drum editing for years and years and years. I find a bit of zen in it and I really enjoy it. So I don't mind having to do that. But yeah, the break in between sessions, between drums and whatever comes next, affords me a bit of time to tighten up the drums and get them to where we need them to be. And then from there, we can be a little bit looser with what goes down. I mean, in pre-production, we've generally got some pretty detailed guide guitars. And I've learnt over the years to really not phone it in during pre-production to make sure the tuning and the performances are usable if we need them to. Because if you you
Yeah.
decide you want to do bass first and your pre-production guitars are all out of tune, then it kind of just, you have a little bit less to fall back on in terms of reference and stuff.
Right. Yeah. I just did pre-production for a heavier song, and
Mhm.
the pre-production took like 6 hours just getting the guitars right,
Yeah,
just in pre-production.
yeah,
And the last song I worked with this band, we ended up using a few of the pre-production guitars
yeah,
to kind of like, stereoize a mono source or something,
yeah.
and just to, it ended up being usable. Like,
Yeah, yeah. That's over the years has I've found that to be the case as well. So I
mhm.
generally try to use the same chain in pre-production as I'm going to be using in final tracking, or at least something very, very usable. Because yeah, I've definitely had those moments where you can't recreate something, or you just wish you had a stereo double track of something, and the band is gone and pre-production isn't usable. So I try to track everything to be
Well,
usable.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess going back to the next step is once the drums and the foundation are solid, you can kind of move on to anything there. I generally have no rules except that I like to track bass after guitars.
Why is that?
A couple of reasons. Primarily that I find that if you ever run into any intonation problems, which, I mean, if you've got good guitars that are set up well and maintained well, and a player that knows how to get the most out of the guitar, and you've done your due diligence in terms of punching in chords and tuning to the chord and stuff like that, then you shouldn't run into any issues. But if you do run into any intonation issues, I think it's a little bit easier to match a bass to the guitar by ear than the other way around, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
If
Only
there's
one
any
note as opposed to a chord.
exactly, yeah, exactly, and less strings, and also too, I find that like the rhythm guitars and the drums in heavy music are kind of the anchors for everything. And bass can voice something in a completely different way depending on how you play it. If you double the guitars, if you counter the guitars, if you harmonize the guitars, it can give something like an overall different feel. And I kind of like to have the anchors put down and subtly color in parts with the bass. So there'll be times where
That's
I
cool.
yeah, where I maybe ask the bass player to harmonize a part, or there might be an opportune part where they can break away from the guitars. And I find once the kind of core foundation is there, being the rhythm guitars and the drums, you get a better idea. The bass,
Yeah.
yeah, it very voices everything in a much different way depending on how you approach it. And I really love recording bass. I'd say out of everything that I record, I probably rewrite the bass parts most.
Hmm.
And generally the bass players are really good to work with and have no issues with that. But I'll find myself kind of rewriting bass parts.
As a bass player, I agree with you. But
Sure, totally.
yeah, you know what you made me think of is the Beatles records. I know, like, specifically on Sgt. Pepper's. I don't know if you're a big Beatles fan,
Yeah,
but
definitely.
but like on Sgt. Pepper's, Paul did the bass like last, like after all
Yeah.
the rest of everything else, and that's how he came up with all those like innovative, creative bass parts that were so melodic and counter
Mhm.
melodic to the vocal, the melodies and stuff. Really like brilliant stuff, and they were able to just kind of like have the space to like it would just be like Paul and Jeff Emmerich recording those bass parts right after everything else was done, and
Yeah,
those are some of the best bass lines to in my opinion, like
agreed.
that like are supportive of the song, but also complement the song in interesting and new ways. So I think that they really got the blend really nicely there, and so it
Agreed.
sounds like you're doing something similar, which is cool. I dig that. What's your
Yeah.
approach to recording bass? Like, are you like a DI guy? Do you amp it? What are your thoughts on bass recording?
Again, generally it will change depending on the subgenre. But generally I'm a DI guy. And then I'll reamp something later if it needs to be reamped. I'm lucky enough to have access to quite a few pretty awesome bass amps and cabs, and own a few myself, and lots of cool pedals and stuff. And yeah, it really depends on the subgenre, and I guess 80% of the time I'm DIing something and we'll end up sticking with the DI in the mix, and that generally just seems to be because if I go to the effort of kind of reamping a really nice organic bass tone with a real analog rig, it ends up going to waste because the way I mix bass guitars is by splitting the bands and treating them pretty radically different. I've generally got like a high, mid, and low band, and unless I want, some of the character of the rig we recorded, it's not going to make it in their full range anyway. It's probably just going to be one of the three bands split up. But I mean, that there has been a thing I've been doing as of recently, and kind of like pretty heavily filtering out all of the low end and then reamping that signal through a guitar amp, and that kind of will account for some of the clangier, more aggressive upper mids and high end of the bass. So it's not always just sim, but generally I'm not doing the mic up an 8x10 with a couple of microphones type thing. It's usually DI and then a few bands of pretty heavily manipulated DIs.
Yeah, metal with bass is so different than all the other genres with bass. So it's and I don't really do metal, but as a bass player, I've never been able to kind of do that kind of split the bands thing of the bass.
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And like I find I lose some punch, and I've tried it a couple times, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll add like a distorted bass underneath, and I'll filter out some of the bottom so that it doesn't clash with like the low end with the kick and everything. But like I'll like filter out an additional bass and bring it up. And I just learned. I was just talking to Dr. Ford on the podcast. The episode just got released this week, and he was telling me. And I knew that but I didn't remember exactly how it worked. But like every time you do like a high pass filter, it switches the phase by like 90 degrees or something. So you got to be careful about how you filter stuff when you're doing that.
It shifts the phase. Yeah.
So you got to be careful with your high pass filters doing that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I've never been able to make it work. What are some of the things that you're able to do with by splitting the bands?
I know where you're coming from, first of all. I mean, it was a bit of an alien concept to me when I first started hearing about it. And I mean, still to this day, I do struggle to maintain some of the glue. All of a sudden, I feel like I'm working on 2 or 3 different bass guitars, and they kind of feel like football fields away from each other in terms of glue once you filter them that heavily. But generally what I'm doing is I've got something that's accounting for my very, very low mids, bass and subs filtered. Then I have a mid track that's kind of going anywhere from 500 up to the upper mids. And then I have a high end presence track that's generally
like
filtering.
5K.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm treating them drastically. And a lot of times too, like I might only just have a low and a mid/high track, that probably goes up to 5K, and then filters off the highs above that. What I'll do is I'll approach the low end of the bass first and try to get that locked in. So my low band I'll probably start off with something to make it sound a little bit less DI-ish, so to speak. I might put like an Ampeg, the Brainworks Ampeg.
It's so good. I use it.
It's
on
really
like
good. Hey.
90% of my basses I use it.
It's really
The
good.
VST.
Hey, yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, everything from that Plugin Alliance bundle is awesome, and the Brainworks stuff particularly. But that one I keep coming back to.
Me too.
Yes, it's got that Ampeg thing to it.
It just adds this punchy woof that just is what you're looking for.
Exactly. Yeah. It's So I'll treat my low band with something like that to make it sound a little bit more a little bit less kind of dry DI. And then I'm using quite a bit of compression to lock the low end into place.